And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, proud sponsor of GTR Africa 2025. ABSA is a registered FSP. Your story matters. 702. Let's walk the talk. Cape Talk, join the conversation. Good evening. Welcome to the program. I'm Stephen Grootes on a day which is probably going to be marked by a couple of things, but one of them certainly is going to be what's happening on US markets right now. The Nasdaq down by over 3%, was down nearly 4% at one point. The S&P 500 down 2%, the Dow Jones down 1.1%. And this is part, I suspect, of an ongoing conversation around growth expectations in the United States. And it shows you how quickly things can shift. Just a week and a half ago, 10 days ago, the story in the US still was growth. Markets were surging ahead now with the tariffs coming from the US President Donald Trump on everything from, Canadian this to Mexican that. Well, suddenly the situation does seem to be changing, and markets for the moment do appear to be sending some kind of signal to the US President to change course. The problem, of course, is even if he said right now, got up on the nearest podium into the nearest microphone and said, I am changing course, I don't know if people would trust him. And that's really going to be the issue. There's a question around legitimacy. I was interested to see what's happening at Barlow World. Their share price ending up very nicely on the day. There's a head consortium saying that they're going to actually still continue with their takeover bid, may not go for an outright delisting, may not own all of the group, but may own a majority share. And if you recall, they were offering 120 Rand a share. The Silchester Group, which owns a very hefty portion of Barlow World, said they wanted 130. Well, you can sort of see where these negotiations might actually go and what's going to happen. So still some strength in the Barlow World story. It's interesting. Clearly, there's a HID consortium, and we shouldn't forget Dominic Sewela, the CEO at Barlow World. There's a part of that have clearly identified some value that they're seeing there that they think makes the group very, very valuable. And I think that is a fascinating thing that we need to just sort of keep an eye on as we go and just watch that story very closely. Just thinking ahead to the budget, and from what I can see, still no certainty on what's going to happen. The question, of course, is what happens if there's no budget on Wednesday, and there'll be some quite complicated sort of legal issues to look at. Technically, the budget is sort of the budget when it's passed by the National Assembly, by Parliament, and that could all, of course, be very delayed. Don't know what happens to salaries past a certain point. Not expecting any kind of US-style shutdown, but it does mean that there are going to be questions asked about credibility, and I think that's going to be the issue. And then we'll be talking about books of quotes in about an hour from now. I don't know if you get these books from quotes. You go to a corporate event, someone gives you a book of quotes. Your stupidest quote, please. Could I ask for the quote that irritated you, enraged you, maybe just through its sheer banality? Maybe it was Justin Bieber offering his thoughts on, I don't know, business sense or something. But something that just struck you as particularly inane, irritating, and unhelpful. Your best, your worst business quote, please. 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. It is ripe for a voice note on 072 702 1702. By the way, just to update you, we've been looking into the issue around the deeds office. You might have heard Julian on the phone last week talking about it. We were in touch with the city of Joburg today. They say it's not them. We did check with Julian. The situation hasn't been resolved. I did see some reports saying the problems that were with the lifts had been resolved, but I understand that is not, in fact, the case. We'll try and get some official comment for you, not today, but tomorrow, and just try and get an understanding of what the situation is and how long it's going to take to actually be resolved. You can imagine the problem you're going to have if you're trying to transfer property, if you're trying to buy or sell property. Lots of things hang off it. These transactions are all linked together. And if you can't actually do it, very, very frustrating. Your thoughts, actually, please, on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. Already, one of the most irritating quotes coming in. The earliest bird catches the worm. I've never caught the worm, says someone. Keep them coming. Your most inane business quotes, please. 12 minutes after 6.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, less than 48 hours to go now until the Finance Minister, Enoch Godongwana, due to stand up in Parliament again and deliver his budget speech. It does seem that there's still no agreement between the ANC and the DA on what it will propose. The DA saying then, and I suspect now, it will not support any increase in VAT. The ANC seems to be suggesting its cabinet ministers would accept a smaller than 2 percentage point hike in VAT. Still endless conversations about what will happen on Wednesday, but most of these conversations are looking at ways to make up the revenue shortfall. Now the group VAT Modernisation, they work with companies to make sure they're compliant with VAT legislation. They say better systems could actually bring in more money from VAT without an increase. Shannon Friedman is the CEO at VAT Modernisation. Shannon, good evening. I suppose this takes us to a question of how much money is falling through the cracks. How much is being lost when it should be going to government in the form of VAT?
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here. So when it comes to VAT compliance and VAT revenue collection, given the current systems that we have in terms of businesses reporting on their VAT and how VAT is currently being collected, we currently have a VAT compliance gap. In other words, a gap between what is actually being collected and what should be collected of around 10 to 15%, okay? And there's some tax experts in the country who even believe it might be higher than that. Now, if you look at the current VAT revenue collection figures, you're looking at a compliance gap of around 50 to 75 billion rand leaking through the system just from VAT collections alone. And what we can see is that countries abroad are modernizing their VAT collection and VAT reporting systems in a way that SARS or the tax authority is not only just seeing an aggregated VAT return where you've got, your inputs and outputs, but they actually have visibility into the underlying transactions, making it a lot more difficult for these VAT leakages to essentially go through the cracks.
Has the compliance gap been growing?
So it tends to fluctuate each year, I guess based on numerous factors. But the thing is it was always in the past more of sort of a reality that I suppose countries had to, take into account. You're never ever going to be in a situation where a government is collecting all the tax, whatever tax type it needs to be collecting. However, with the introduction of new technologies that do make it possible for tax authorities to have this level of granular visibility into businesses' transaction and therefore make it a lot more difficult for underreporting of VAT liabilities to take place. It doesn't matter, I guess, in terms of, what it was like in the past, but more so the fact that it's much more possible to take advantage of those technologies in order to be collecting that is a lot more easier given the systems and technologies that are available to us.
Would it be expensive? I mean, would it cost government a lot more money to improve its systems, make everything a lot more efficient? And I imagine some of this compliance burden might fall on businesses too.
Sure. Look, with any change in systems and regulations and frameworks, there's obviously going to be some sort of cost to bear. SARS on their side are going to need to be investing in systems that they're able to accept this type of information. It's a lot more granular, a lot more data that they would be dealing with, and they would need to look into that on their side. When it comes to companies as well, essentially it depends on the type of solution that becomes prevalent in our country that they would take up. What we try to advise businesses on is to look into solutions that integrate with their existing systems, their existing technology stack, in order to make such types of transitions as seamless and as simple as possible without bearing this large cost of essentially a systems overhaul, which is what you want to avoid.
Shannon Friedman, thanks very much indeed, CEO at VAT Modernisation. Do appreciate the time. Well, I suppose the situation really shows the problems in our politics. And frankly, despite all of the heat over the last few weeks about the budget, I've not seen any new ideas to break the economic situation that we're in. Sometimes, frankly, I feel that our politics is stuck in a quagmire, and so is our economy as a direct result of it. We can't get out of this. Of course, one does sort of lead to the other, but there are other factors as well. Professor Keribone Pago is director at the School for Government Studies at Northwest University. Professor Pago, good evening. How do you see it? Is there any realistic prospect of our change in our politics that could lead to more economic growth in anything like the short term, let's say over the next 5 years?
Good evening, Stephen. Thank you for having me. I think we have to be hopeful, Stephen, that there will be some, breakthrough of some sort from this budget problem that we are facing at the moment. My assessment is that we were dealing with the ANC that is still coming to terms with the reality that it is no longer an ANC with a majority in parliament, and so it needs to recognize that there are other key players that it has to fully consult and bring them into their confidence if they want to make sure that South Africa and our budget is working for the citizens.
I mean, I remember President Cyril Ramaphosa very clearly saying that the main priority of his government, so of all the parties in his government, and I presume of all of the ministers in his government, would be to create jobs. And if you do that, by the way, you're going to win an election. And I don't see anyone focusing on that at all. I mean, I've asked small business owner after small business owner on this program, has the Small Business Development Ministry done anything for you? None of them have said yes.
So I think that is the real problem, Stephen, that many of our public institutions have been hijacked completely, and that they are no longer serving the purpose for which they were created. So, across the board, whether it is a municipality, whether it's a state-owned enterprise, whether it's a department that has to give, like the small business that has to give loans. In fact, there was also a debate at some point in Parliament where the EFF were asking somebody from the Youth Commission and say, give us the at least 3 companies from a young people that you have given loans to, and they could not come up with any meaningful response. So we are in a very difficult situation, and I would argue that the bulk of the problem comes from the dysfunctioning ANC. But I think those days are almost behind us now.
And replaced by what? Because I mean, if I look, for example, in Joburg, it seems to me that the ANC will lose votes in Joburg, but I don't know where those votes are going to go.
So you're right, because we also don't know where those votes are going to go. I think it's going to depend on where you are. So if you are in Joburg, my prediction, looking at the current dynamics, is that the winners would definitely be the DA, will be some of the smaller parties like the Rise Mzansi, like the Herman Mashaba's party. So I think we will see a interesting distribution of votes. But when you are in provinces like KZN, like Mpumalanga, I think we will see the re-emergence of the IFP to some degree, because maybe it looks like the MK traction is actually losing ground. So I think it will definitely really depend on where you are and what kind of elections are taking place.
That means then that to form a budget, I mean, this might seem like the good old days in a few years' time. You just need 2 parties to agree, the ANC and the DA, and if they come to an agreement, the budget will be passed. In a few years' time, you might need 3 or 4, 5, 6 parties to agree to pass a budget. And doesn't that just lead to horse trading? There'll be no ideology. It's just about everybody sticking in power. And this has happened in places, I think, like Kenya might be an example. And isn't that going to be the future of our politics? And I don't see how we get economic growth out of that.
So that is one part of it, and I think it's an excellent observation, because we've seen it in many countries that are dealing with coalitions, that often that is a reality. But the other view I hold very strongly is that the kind of a pushback that the coalition members have given to ANC to say, we will not have a budget speech tabled today, let's postpone it, has set a very good precedent for any political party that is going to be in government at a particular point in time in future, that you will have to engage your coalition partners, because it needs to be consulted properly, so it serves the purpose for South Africans and not just for a political party or certain individuals that are influential in those political parties.
What happens to SOEs in all of this? at the moment, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think I understood you to suggest that it wasn't just government departments, but also SOEs that have become hopelessly politicized during the ANC period in government. Does the same thing happen, sort of divvying out? I mean, we've seen that in Joburg, I think, when we've had coalitions. The IFP gets, to chair the Joburg Roads Agency. This person gets to chair that. I mean, are we going to see something similar? That means that there's no hope for Transnet, for example.
So we need to see a lot of that coming. And in fact, we also need to see a lot of civil society rising and keeping these politicians accountable and having an interest in knowing who is, the profiles of people who are presiding over this institution. So far, we only wait for a scandal and we chase the scandal and it disappears and then we move on to the next. But I think we are not very well organized as academia, as the media, as a civil society to say what can we do to make sure that the government has a proper agenda. So far, we really don't know whether we are coming or going, as long as we can, try to make, some good pointers here and there. But I think it's time now that we need to find a way of consolidating ourselves as a civil society, as media, as academia, to set a very proper agenda that will make sure that politicians account and that they set our path into a very positive trajectory.
So all of this requires negotiation and agreement, and I just don't know if we're going to get that. What I'm trying to say is if we don't sort out the politics, and I don't know if we will, I fear we will never sort out the economy, and that is surely a massive problem. The number of young unemployed people is only going to grow, and that is not giving the politicians any urgency.
That's correct, because if we have more young people who are now, getting more and more unemployed, that is a recipe for disaster, Stephen. So we really want to see if the president, because he talks quite a lot about, employment, but we really see, just a drop in the ocean. But we want to see him showing leadership, not only him, we want to see premiers, we want to see mayors demonstrating competence and showing leadership. So if we don't find ways of keeping these people to account and knowing what is the goal of, province A, what is Gauteng going to achieve with G20, for example, in terms of employment opportunities for young people, we are just going to be in a perpetual cycle. So I think we also have to take some blame, some responsibility as, citizens of this country and say, what are we really doing to make sure that these people know their role and that they are contributing meaningfully to the growth and development of South Africa.
Professor Keribone Pachel, really appreciate the time, sir. Thank you. Director at the School for Government Studies at Northwest University.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Sierra Mbartas, investment analyst at Old Mutual Investment Group. Sierra, good evening to you. We'll get to US markets in a moment, but just a couple of results first. AVI, their earnings were up, problems with their fashion supply chains, and that punished the share.
Sure, Stephen. Good evening to everyone at home. SA reporting season is in full swing. AVI came up with their half-year results. They were quite resilient, actually, with the Entice division, which is their beverages, their coffee and their tea division, being quite resilient, and they did quite well there. But they had a few issues in the other division. So their Snackworks, which is their baker's biscuits division, underperformed, as well as their personal care and their footwear business. And so with the footwear, that business has been underperforming for quite some time, specifically the Green Cross brand, for a number of years now. And I think management have taken the decision to close those stores, and they're looking to operate a wholesale model. So I think the main issue is, so although the result was quite resilient, it's actually management's outlook for the second half that's led to the decline in the share price, about 5% for AVI.
The Sunbet, also Sun International rather, put out an update. There's still money to be made in the gambling business, clearly.
Well, if you're in gaming, it's absolutely booming. I've read a few articles where they've actually spoken about how South Africans have spent about 1.1 trillion in gaming in 2024, and that was up 40% from 2023. And the biggest driver of that was sports gaming, and that's exactly where Sun International are positioned with their Sunbet online sports betting platform. And that's done quite resiliently well. So the trading update was a bit light in the detail, but they did manage to mention that the EBITDA was ahead of their expectations that they previously set out. I think they were targeting about 900 million in EBITDA by 2028, and they feel that they can exceed those growth targets. So it seems as though that business is doing quite well. So they had expected for the full year that they expected about 14 to 20% earnings growth, which is quite material in this type of economy. I think what's a bit concerning is the key driver around the sports betting. Just having a look around the market, consumers are not in a great position, and it seems as though certain individuals are potentially taking on bets to actually cover the cost of living, which is a bit concerning.
Just in the US here, if we've got a moment, I mean, the NASDAQ is down 3.5%, the S&P 500 down 2%, the Dow Jones down 1.12%. And clearly investors there are growing a bit more concerned about the US economy. I presume this is all about tariffs?
Sure. Tariffs, but the implications of policy uncertainty. So with Trump 2.0, there's been increased uncertainty, and you can most certainly see that in the VIX. So the VIX is effectively the indicator that lets us know about volatility within the market, and it's currently pushing at 26. And it was about around the mid-teens a few months ago. So there's been a notable increase in market volatility, and with increased policy uncertainty, things aren't good. And there are a number of implications downstream. So if you think about second order, third order effects, with policy uncertainty, investors adopt a risk-off mindset, and you can see that in the share prices. But for the man on the ground, policy uncertainty means that you're not certain about your future work prospects, especially if you work in government at the moment. So you're not certain about your income, you're not certain about the value of your savings going forward, and you're certainly not certain about whether you'll be able to afford things in the future. And then if you take it at another level, if you look at businesses, there is a inability or lack of clarity in being able to plan ahead, especially with tariffs, because your inputs essentially could cost one thing the one day, and then the next could cost something else. So it makes it really difficult to plan for the future. And then on the government level, from a revenue perspective, if you look at the biggest composition of government or federal revenue, that's income taxes. And so if individuals' incomes aren't growing, that calls into question the plans around income tax. And so I think the consequences are further reaching, and there's a great deal of uncertainty, which is why we're seeing a lot of earnings expectations being tapered, and we've seen a lot of S&P earnings expectations being tempered most recently. And so I guess the outlook is a bit concerning, and I think most recently the number of mentions of the word recession have popped up, and the risk of a recession as a result of this policy uncertainty and tariffs.
Sierra Mbata, thanks very much indeed. Investment analyst at the Old Mutual Investment Group.
7:02. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, good to hear from you. Your worst quotes from any book of business quotes ever, please. On 011 883 0702 021 4460 567, and voice notes, of course, on 072 702 1702. Well, you heard a little earlier about US indices dropping significantly. Mainly, it seems, because of fears about the economic policy followed by the US President Donald Trump. The NASDAQ is down 3.59 as I talk to you. The Dow Jones down sort of 1.3. The S&P 500 down about 2.3 at the moment. The NASDAQ was down almost 4% at one point. Jason Babora-Sheen is the manager of the 91 Diversified Income Fund. Jason, good day to you, and thanks for your time today. Very sharp decline so far on US markets. We've seen all the talk and the announcements of tariffs and more to come, we understand. Are markets overreacting?
I think in a way they're just undoing some of the euphoria and extreme optimism that was baked in during the fourth quarter. So I think it's a fairly rational response in many ways to the fact that we believe that the policy under the new administration is not focused on the equity market. It's much more focused on the bond market, actually.
Okay, so does that mean then, do you expect these losses to be sustained over time? Is there a bit more pain to come?
Yeah, I think there possibly is. So ultimately, as ever with markets, when it appears obvious, it's probably the time to start going the other way. So in many senses, we think that tactically you could see some improvement in equity indices and then some reversal in the rallies we've seen for bond markets. But that actually, in the medium term, investors should be much more cautiously positioned. They should be much more pro-bond positioned. And I think that's because the administration really is focused on reforming the fiscal and trade nature of the US. I'm not sure that many people took that seriously when Donald Trump was elected. So they were going by the playbook of his first term, in which ultimately he appeared very concerned by the stock market. So if we think back to 2016 through to, let's say, 2018, there were basically a calculation that nearly 160 tweets from Donald Trump concerned the stock market. If we fast forward to today, there's been one explicit mention of the stock market on Truth Social, his social media platform, and then one referring to it over the weekend, in which he's basically said, we're not concerned about the stock market. It is the US 10-year, which is the hallmark of whether we're being successful. And that is then given further mirroring by the likes of Treasury Secretary Bessent and the 333 program, which concerns essentially the trade-offs between inflation and growth. And I think ultimately Donald Trump elected on a mandate to get inflation back down. And a lot of the policy making, which is occurring, actually hones in on that. So we do think that the equity market, coming from quite lofty valuations, has seen a meaningful reset. Now equities are essentially down from the 5th of November, the point of election, and US bond yields are lower. And that probably wasn't in the consensus expectations.
Okay, so you talk about reform, so there's a plan. What is the sort of plan then? What's the sort of longer-term game here if he's clearly following some sort of strategy, and he seems to suggest there might be an aim in mind, where's he headed?
So I do believe there is a much stronger ideology behind this administration than many give credit for. Ultimately, Donald Trump himself has been against globalization and pro-tariffs over sort of 40 years now. And the first explicit mention of it goes back to the late 80s, after he lost a bid for a piano, I think from the movie Casablanca, against a Japanese bidder. Obviously, Japan at that point, a much more strong international power economically. And he then took out an advert proposing that tariffs should be made more explicit against the likes of Japan at that point. And that ideology has continued on over the preceding 4 decades. And those around him do also, I think, believe strongly that you need to reform the US's financial position. And it's quite a sort of grandiose idea, but you're essentially going from when this concept of Pax Americana existed, in which America was a sort of benign polar center in many ways of the world, so policing the other democracies of the developed world and holding sort of Russia and China ultimately at bay. And now I think they're becoming much more focused on their own interests and moving away from that. And that does change things enormously. It doesn't mean that things will play out in the way that you might automatically expect. It could mean a weaker dollar. It could certainly mean a weaker stock market. And it could mean a stronger treasury market over the medium term. And that's where we would suggest investors start to focus.
Does that lead to a better life for most Americans?
It might do, because ultimately, if you look at the voter base for Donald Trump, it's been hollowed out over the last 40 years. Globalization, from the perspective of the administration, has not worked for many voting Americans. So I think there's this time frame, at least early on, in which it's seen as Biden's economy, for the first 6 to 12 months of the administration. It can be phrased as a hangover from the excesses of the Democrats. And then going forward, it's seen as Trump's economy. And I guess you have a position where you have underlying everything a quite robust and resilient US, so that if you slow to below or at trend, it probably doesn't cause a great deal of damage. It's not like prior to the GFC, where you're sort of taking out growth around a sort of credit-driven cycle. This has been a much more income-led one. So I think they probably can afford to slow the economy through some of these policies, and then for it to reaccelerate later into the midterms, and then ultimately in the election cycle.
There are quite a lot of ifs to this because there are other actors, by which I mean other countries, particularly with regard to tariffs, will respond too. And while obviously the United States is still the world's biggest economy, there are some points at which some of those economies can inflict some pain on the United States, and obviously China is the main one. But even Canada has a lever or two, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. I ultimately think tariffs do represent some form of rebalancing of the US's position. I think, though, that they are probably more negative for US growth than they are positive for US inflation in the shorter term, i.e. growth is likely to fall by more than inflation goes up if you have a concerted approach to tariffs. Part of the reason I think the market is struggling currently is that we have this sort of back and forth around tariffs, whereby it seems as though a more concerted plan is being put forward, only for it then to be pulled back. And I suppose markets ultimately, particularly risk assets like equities, like a degree of certainty in the backdrop, and that's what they're not getting currently. But if you do believe that this more ideological reform is in process, then yes, I agree with you that you could lead to a sort of quite negative spiral in growth and with less inflation, which is probably bond positive ultimately. I do think, though, that the US can probably sustain that, again, early on in this cycle. And perhaps much of the back and forth is this art of the deal that Trump is famed for.
I mean, lots of other things are going to happen. There are other actors in the United States too, and I don't mean the Democrats or political opposition to Trump. I mean corporate opposition to Trump. If I remember correctly, the CEOs of the three biggest US car companies phoned him to basically try and stop the imposition of tariffs, and that would affect their industry, tariffs on Canada and the United States, and that led to an exemption. I mean, there are other people who have a huge amount to lose through him pursuing this particular policy, who have all sorts of levers in different ways.
I do. It was interesting over the weekend. He had an interview in which he referred to the fact that the Chinese think about their strategy in decades and the US has thought about it in quarters. And I'm not sure ultimately if it's a real desire to leave behind a legacy, which I think there are signs that this is what this administration wishes to do, that ultimately they believe that the US needs to be more inward-looking than outward, that they are going to stop what they're doing simply because of some of corporate America standing up. And ultimately this idea of the Trump puts, that he is very sensitive to the equity market, appears simply not to be true in this administration. He hasn't made it a hallmark in the way that he did in the first administration. And even actually in 2018, you still had a 20% drawdown in the S&P 500 in the fourth quarter when the trade war narrative really took off against then a backdrop of the Fed tightening policy, granted. But that only seemed to bring to a head, Trump's policymaking after some quite dramatic moves in the equity market. So I think they can probably sustain a bit more pain, as I say, early on in the administration than they might do if it were coming towards midterms.
Jason, thank you very much indeed. Do appreciate those insights. Jason Babora-Sheen is the manager of the 91 Diversified Income Fund. Well, meanwhile, while all of that's going on in the United States and those markets, our farmers trying to work out what it will cost them if Trump does remove us from AGOA. Around 4% of our total food exports go to the US. 40% of that benefits from AGOA. The CEO at AgriSA is Johann Kotze. Johann, good evening to you. I'm sure you've done interview after interview and speech after speech about this issue. But presumably, if we get kicked out of AGOA, our agricultural sector, your members, are going to be significantly affected.
Yeah, I think it might seem small, but you need to understand the impact thereof might be large for certain industries. And I think the effect thereof normally goes down to the rural areas because that's where we farm. So it's detrimental that there's a possibility that we would be able to lose it. But in saying it, us as farmers, we always have hope. I think trade all over the world is disrupted by what is happening in the USA. And we believe then if this one is closed, we need to look for new opportunities. I think that there will be new opportunities, and we believe in what we can do in the produce that we can put forth. And so as farmers, we have hope, and we believe that if we're going to fight to keep AGOA open, if it's not open, we believe then we will have new markets, and we will push the existing markets. So there will be an outcome.
So, I mean, that would obviously take us to BRICS, and I didn't realize this, but some of the tariffs to get your products into BRICS partners is actually much higher. India has a tariff of 50%, and we can argue about BRICS solidarity with India all we like. Their farmers are a very loud, very vocal political lobby. That's not going to change. Those kinds of things must have an impact on you.
Yeah, it does. And I think that's the opportunity now. So it feels like in Afrikaans we say, jy's kuddy meelsakke. And it feels like we've been shaken from all over, and specifically to the trade negotiations that we have. And it is important to us because we export 50% of what we produce. So the take again is not to go with arrogance into new trade negotiations and tell people what to do, but to focus and make sure that if we get 5% off, 10% off, and you go with this, all of a sudden there's a new way of understanding trade. And I think what is happening now, this disruption, puts a lot of new focus on say, but have a look on what we do and where we are, and can we do it better?
Are you lobbying to try and get these issues on the BRICS agenda, for example? I think there are tariffs that are imposed on your products by China as well. Is there any appetite for that in BRICS? I don't know if there is, really.
Yeah, remember, it's not a trading platform, so it's a difficult one to do. There's talks, and we've ventured some with the talks that's happening. So you need to be very careful in the way you kind of approach this. If it was a trading platform and you can negotiate and put it down, but this is not a trading platform. So lobbying, yes, in different ways, and I think there's a lot of focus for all the countries to be more sensitive towards trade restrictions, and specifically trade. It's not trade barriers, the tariffs that we pay.
There are a lot of other things that are going on at the moment. You make the point that trade has been disrupted everywhere by this, and that's true. If global trade is disrupted, the knock-on effects to us are massive. Because we don't kind of always realize it, but our food prices, what we pay for food, is kind of smoothed out by international trade. Yes, we eat a lot of food that's grown in other places. We export, as you say, 50% of what we produce, which is a huge amount. But if we did not trade nearly as much, we would be dependent literally on how much rain we get in certain parts of the country, and that would be it. I mean, I don't want to overplay this. I don't think we're here. But someone somewhere is going to have to start planning for major trade disruption, I fear.
Yeah, my take is, I think what we also need to understand is people need to eat. And all over the world, people are used to certain trade routes and certain trade agreements we have. And if you take it away, a lot of the countries are not self-sufficient and are not food secure in the way that we are. So we look at it from a different way. We believe that we as farmers in South Africa play a major role towards the economy of South Africa, but specifically towards the food security in South Africa and Africa, and also to the rest of the world. And the play thereof is always going to be there. So the need for food is going to be the driver, and not the trade itself. So I think there's a shift coming in the way that we traded in the past. So the hope for us as farmers is we sit with the produce or products that is absolutely essential in the world. COVID showed that to us. So we are of a firm belief there would always be a market, and we're going to pursue those markets and make sure that we sell our produce.
Are there particular sectors you're more worried about than others that may be more vulnerable to disruption in trade with the US?
Yeah. I must say, I think if you look at America, I think the AVO is focused a lot on America. Although AVO is all over the world, there's a big demand for that. But it's special, like of groupings that go to specific markets, and there's various reasons thereof. I think if you look at a go in America, I think the nuts, wines to a certain extent is going to be affected, and then citrus. But again, you know what? Other opportunities going to come up, and it's already happening. Some markets opening up. There's demand for certain of our produce, so we will find a way out of this.
Thanks very much indeed. Johann Kotze is the CEO at AgriSA. Really appreciate the time on The Money Show.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of GTR Africa 2025.
Well, lots to come in the next hour. We'll talk about books of quotes. Do any of them really mean anything? Are they all just sort of a waste of time? Or are there one or two little pearls of wisdom who speak to the liquor industry as well? They suggest that, in fact, excise on spirits should be reduced. And then Tebogo, ProVerb's Thekisho, he'll tell you about his career, how he's been making his money to get through life in about half an hour from now. Really looking forward to that as well. Someone who's done many different things through his career. You know the number as well. Be good to hear from you tonight. You with The Money Show. It's 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, proud sponsor of GTR Africa 2025. ABSA is a registered FSB. Your story matters. 702. Let's walk the talk. The talk, Cape Talk, join the conversation. Good evening to you. You can join our conversation this evening. Your worst ever business quote. Maybe it's something that people keep saying, something inane, someone put on a sticker somewhere, now you can't, you've scratched it off your desk, and it just won't go. You know, that kind of thing. It's just every day you're stuck with the banal nature, the sort of doff, the kind of just adds no value to anyone kind of nature of this quote. Be good to hear yours, please, on 011 883 0702 and 021 446 0567. We'll look at that in a moment. We'll talk about alcohol and excise tax. And then a moment ago, I was able to go and shake the hand of Tebogo, ProVerb's Thekisho. He'll be telling you about his career, how he's kept himself in business over the last 20 years or so. I think he goes back. We'll talk to him about that from 7:30. Looking forward to that conversation on The Money Show.
The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
On the next Money Show, Charles Russon, the interim Group Chief Executive Officer of ABSA, will take you through that company's financial results. Personal finance and co-founder of Galileo Capital, Warren Ingram, will talk to you about why you should not reduce the risk in your investment profile as you get older. Dr. Otendo Ndwingi, founding director at Tribe Africa Advisory, on the Africa Report. Also, all of the top business news of the day.
WhatsApp Stephen
On 072
702.
1702.
Well, more now on the budget. We still don't have an agreement. We don't entirely know what's going to happen. It would seem generally the voices calling for more tax may be a bit louder than the voices calling for less tax. But ahead of that, the South African Liquor Brand Owners Association now suggesting that Enoch Godongwana, the finance minister, should reduce or reconsider the amount of excise tax that's charged on spirits. They suggest government should keep excise in line with inflation because the illicit economy is growing at their expense. Kurt Moore is the CEO at Silver. Kurt, good evening to you. Most people are calling for taxes on alcohol to be increased to make up for the budget shortfall. You've picked an interesting moment to go the other way.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to your listeners. Yes, Stephen, let's take a step back. I think if you go to the government policy, government has set a policy in 2014 now, setting excise tax on spirits at about 36%, and that's just for excise tax, excluding VAT. A series of increases above inflation over the years has pushed that above the target. So we're arguing that government should at least stick to its policy. And to get back to the targeted incidence rate of 36%, perhaps either keeping it level or freezing it all together is our thinking.
Okay, so what would be the benefit to government of doing that?
Well, the benefit to government is, we believe government is losing about 11.3 billion rand in revenue to the illicit operators. And if we start tightening up our regulations and enforcing our laws, we should be able to recoup that. But I also think, that the industry, the legal industry that is the most efficient force in the fight against illicit trade. These products tend to be sold much cheaper than legal products. And if we could compete with them more fairly, I think we could recoup some of those losses and we'll pay the taxes. So, that 11.3 billion rand, it's not quite the 60 billion rand that government anticipates from the increase in VAT, but it helps to close the deficit.
The illicit industry, are we talking about people smuggling in spirits tax-free, or are we talking about people making spirits illegally here?
We're talking about both. There is an element of smuggling. Both ethanol, the raw material used to make alcohol, is smuggled in bulk, and finished product. That split is around about 15 to 85%. So the majority of the products coming in is finished products. They're not quite compliant with our Liquor Products Act, so they shouldn't be sold in the country, but they are sold in the country. And then we do have what we call counterfeit and illicit products, where you are refilling empty bottles of legitimate bottles with cheaper alcohol.
Does anyone know how big the illicit industry actually is? I mean, I presume SARS would go for them and the way it goes for the illicit tobacco industry.
Our estimate is that its value is around about 20.5 billion rand. If you look at that in terms of a volume, that's 22%. That's almost 1 in 5 bottles in the market could be illicit. We did a study in 2017 and then again in 2020, just in terms of its volumes. Its cumulative annual growth rate was about 10%. So it is growing. We plan to do another study this year, but I'm not convinced that we're winning the battle.
Okay. I mean, how important is pricing in the sale of spirits? So obviously there are one or two alternatives. You can drink beer, you could drink wine, but does the price? So this really gets to excise, right? Does the pricing matter that much in how many spirits are sold? And there's obviously a natural experiment every year because sin taxes tend to go up, and you would see an impact.
Yeah. Well, I think price does play a significant role. The study that we conducted in 2021 shows that it's a combination of the poor economic climate, weak regulation enforcement, and also our taxation strategies. We have shrinking incomes, rising unemployment in the country, and consumers are looking for cheaper alternatives. And unfortunately, in the illicit space, or in the alcohol industry, that includes illicit products.
It does seem, though, that your industry is making money. I mean, sorry to point this out, Kurt, but if you sell alcohol, if you sell an addictive product, you probably will be able to make money. But is your industry really suffering a financial loss because of all of this?
I think both the industry and the fiscus is suffering a loss. As I said, 11.3 billion rand. And 22% of the market is illicit. So if you had that been sold through legal channels, it would benefit government, and that's our proposition in this in the proposal to government is we will recoup some of the lost market share and earn more and continue our contribution to the economy.
Kurt, there's a lot going on around tax at the moment, and I can't help but wonder if we might at some point have a much bigger discussion about where government should get revenue from and then how it should spend that revenue. Obviously, that would be an important moment for you to try and make your point. I suspect, though, you might be going against public opinion, and particularly after the pandemic, it seemed to me that actually government and much of society was going to sort of harden attitudes against your industry. It hasn't happened in any legal sense, I must just say, since then. But I think you might find that to win the battle of public opinion is quite a tough one for you.
Yeah, to win the battle of public opinion is indeed tough. And when we look at government's challenges, we have an ever-increasing deficit that needs to be closed. And perhaps, alcohol is the easier target. But what we're suggesting, as I said, is almost counterintuitive, that, in fact, you probably would get less tax from the legal industry. In 2013, our revenue that was generated from spirits decreased by 13%. And, we put that down to the legal industry losing business to the illegal industry.
Presumably, then, if this continues, the illegal industry would simply grow unless there's a change in compliance, unless we're actually able to, stop it. We're just going to see that grow, particularly if it provides cheaper products. So, in other words, the outlook is there's a trajectory that we need to change sort of now.
Absolutely. And that's why we say, 12th of March is an opportunity to tangibly address that, and passing on an increase that is double the inflation rate. The January number was 3.2. All the media reports suggest that what was in the original budget was 6.83, and there's some scary stories emanating from various sources saying it could potentially go up, and that concerns us.
Kurt Moore, thank you very much indeed, the CEO of the South African Liquor Brands Association. Really appreciate the time on The Money Show tonight.
7:02. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Just to pick up on that thought about having a bigger debate around a budget. I mean, about where we get money from and where we would actually spend it. And you would think this would be the moment that we would do that. This would be the moment in which you would actually see that government, political parties, everybody would be sitting down and starting that kind of process. Unfortunately, I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think we're going to see a sort of divvying up between political parties. Can we agree on this? Can we agree on that? And I don't know if it's going to get any further than that. And I suspect, and I'm interested in that, people as diverse as Colin Coleman and Neil Coleman, who have very different views on the world, both believe there is a place for zero-based budgeting at this point, and that we would need to sort of start again in some way. I just don't see that that is what is going to happen at this point. And there are a couple of reasons why. And the one is simply what you would call entrenched interests. The people who have something, the insiders in our economy, whether they be inside government or inside business, and are actually doing all right, they're not going to give anything up. And the people outside are just going to have to sit and watch for an even longer period. They're going to keep trying, don't get me wrong. We're still going to see a lot of political pressure on this. But that may be, I'm afraid to say, the most logical, or the most, let me put it like this, the most natural outcome, the most likely outcome, there's the phrase I'm looking for, the most likely outcome to all of this is that the budget will muddle through, nothing will really change. We'll do it all again next year, and it'll become the same kind of rigmarole. That's my unfortunate prediction for the future, for the moment at least.
The Money Show.
Business Books.
Well, Bronwyn Williams is a partner at Flux Trends. She's also an expert on the future of finance. She's looking at the book Two Thoughts, a timeless collection of infinite wisdom by Jim O'Shaughnessy and Vatsal Kaushik. Bronwyn, good evening. I have to say, I've known you a little while. I was slightly surprised by your choice.
Slightly surprised by my choice. Well, I was given this book to read by Jim, which I think influenced my choice a little bit. But I think it's also something that could, shall we say, be a bit of a palate cleanser for the political and economic times that we're in. And the reason why I recommend it for people in the world of business, in the world of investing, is that Jim is one of those people who is actually an investor that has some influence over the way the world works. He's also very tapped into the Silicon Valley sort of philosophy and community that is dictating so much of the policy that we see coming out of the US. And what this collection is essentially almost a continuation of his quite well-received and well-known Twitter account, whereby he quite often posts not one, but two, sometimes slightly contradictory quotes from people that he has been reading, listening to, or working with, which is really interesting. So if you are an investor trying to get an insider's ear and eye into how people that have money and capital to deploy are making their decisions, what they're looking, what they're paying attention to, and who they're paying attention to, this book is full of clues to exactly that. The inside world, as you know, those memes say, the whole world is like a country club and you're just not invited to the party. Well, these are the people that are inside the party, and this is what they're saying, and this is what they're talking to each other about.
Do some of the quotes really stick with you that much? I mean, it's quite an interesting thing. I mean, infinite wisdom, that's a heavy sell.
It's a heavy sell, and I probably don't quite live up to that. But I wouldn't say the quotes so much as some of the people. Like some of the people that he has chosen are the likes of Anna Gatt. Again, someone that your listeners might not be familiar with, but who is having an underground, again, influence on the sorts of people and the sorts of places that are dictating the world that we see around us. She's the founder of a movement called the Inter-Intellect, which is basically a society of contemporary salons that take place both online through like closed-door, invite-only, pay-gated Zoom calls, or in person and even more closed-door environments where she invites the likes of Peter Thiel to communicate in a very sort of a fireside chat kind of a format with other thinkers who are shaping the world, both of business and philosophy and academia and politics. And she's collected global influence of these very influential people who, as I said, she facilitates these salon-style conversations, but are having an instrumental impact on a whole lot of the things that we see around us, the businesses that are started, the ideas that are trickling down and trickling up, and really having an impact on our world. So this is why I think that this is interesting. You got to have a look at the people who you haven't heard of in this book, turn to their pages, and then go find out a bit more about them. Why are these people being picked up? And I think we're seeing a lot of that in our world at the moment, where these ideas of people that you've never heard of before are suddenly, their names are being dropped into New York Times and Atlantic articles, sort of op-eds, because these are the sorts of ideas that are now finding their way into American politics, which is therefore finding its way into our geopolitical world. So the likes, of course, your sort of like your network state propagators or pushers, the people who think that if you're wealthy enough, you should not only be able to buy your way into a lower tax bracket, as what normally happens with rich people, but you should be able to buy your way, in fact, into an entirely tax and rule-free zone, for example. These are the sorts of people and ideas who get sort of propagated in these sorts of circles, in these sorts of spaces. But Jim is also a voracious reader, just to sort of put this into context, and I love the man dearly, and he reads a lot of books by a lot of interesting people, from the likes of Jed McKenna, again, a pseudonymous philosopher that you've probably never heard of, but again, whose ideas around sort of, shall we say, libertarian enlightenment are, again, the sorts of ideas that you're going to start seeing as the sort of, I don't know, what we want to call this, sort of the progressive populist right sort of takes place and center stage in our politics and economics.
For a period at least.
Yes, for a period, they center stage, if not center altogether.
Yes, yes. I suppose there's another question. So what makes a quote great? I mean, if you're going to select, as they have, a collection of these things, and they're all over the place, and there's so many quotes. I mean, I made the point earlier, that some of them are just word salads. What makes a quote great? And I suppose the first thing is that it needs to distill something. It needs to get to the heart of something. It also does need to be punchy and memorable.
It needs to be punchy and memorable. It needs to lead to a point of view. What Jim likes to do, both in his Twitter account and through his writing and books, and he is very inspired, and he'll admit this himself, by the philosopher Jed McKenna again, is to say things almost cryptically, right? So the sort of way of saying something without actually saying it. And he said that he's made his sort of Twitter career by filtering his opinions through other people's words in order to say things or provoke thoughts that might have been caught up in, say, internet censor machines, or been the cause for rage bait and rage clicking and rage posting and even cancellation if they were said out loud. So a lot of the sort of quotes that you'd read here, read for the implicit, almost dog whistle behind them to get why these sorts of quotes were chosen. And again, always read them in the pair, because what he's very good at doing is selecting these quotes that you can kind of compare and contrast, or that put together say something that is a bit more than the individual quote on its own.
I mean, I must say it's an interesting format to have quotes next to each other. You don't often see that. That must give it some value that you don't see in other booklets or other books.
Yes, I mean, it is literally just a book of quotes. That's the end of the day, but it's hopefully a book of quotes that point towards a particular worldview and point towards sort of a greater ideas, the ideas that they are just as written. And of course, some of them are quite fun to read and quite witty, and there's authors in there that people that have a good way with words. Who's not in the book, which I did find almost personally offensive, is that there's no Terry Pratchett quotes in the book. So of course that removes at least one star from its potential review criteria.
No, well, quite right, of course. Do you think there's a lot of future for books like this? I mean, when you can access almost anything, it's all about the curation, and curation suddenly becomes very important with these things.
It's the curation and, of course, the curator before. The reason people read things like this is to think about who the authors, who are influencers in their own way, even though they're not necessarily influencers of shoes and handbags, they're certainly influencers of investors and of investing patterns and of VC funds. So you kind of want to know what the curator is interested in if you are looking at these sorts of things. So think of it as the influencing of ideas, which is actually becoming more, not less important in the days of AI sludge and mediocrity, right? We've all got access to everything all the time, but what we don't have access to is that taste makery, right? That idea of what it is that we should be looking at, given that we have limited time, limited attention, limited resources. We look to others who have influence, who have some degree of power and wealth, and say, okay, what is it that they are looking at? And therefore, what perhaps I should be looking at too. And this is in some ways an indictment of us, all of us that have access to the whole world's information. Instead of going off on that journey ourselves, instead of going and figuring out what's important to us, we instead look to people who we admire or respect or want to be like, and look at what they're looking for. And this, of course, is mimetic behavior, which is one of those ideas we also see creep through in this sort of books, one of those Silicon VC investing corner of the world ideas that comes through there, as do, of course, the ideas around libertarianism and thinking for yourself. These are the sorts of threads and ideas that you are going to find in such a text.
I'm always intrigued as to why people put books like this together. I understand why some do it. They just want to make money. But I don't know if this is going to change minds. I mean, if you're going to change the minds of people, there are other ways to do it now rather than through a book of quotes.
Yeah, they are. But I think what the intention here is to use this as a starting point, as I say, to go and find the person that you haven't heard of, the author that you haven't read, and therefore go and research more about them and go read the real deal. So you can almost see this as a tasting menu of ideas that Jim and co think are important, that they hope people will go out and find out more about and draw their own opinions from thereafter.
Bronwyn Williams, thanks very much indeed. Really appreciate it. Trend translator and future finance specialist with you this evening. And of course, she's at Flux Trends.
702 with Stephen Grootes.
Email him on stephen@702.co.za.
Well, of course, lots to come in a few moments. Looking forward to the conversation we're going to be having with Tebogo, ProVerb's Thekisho. He'll be on your radio, just talking a little bit about his life. He's done some radio, as you know. He's done all sorts of different things. A lot of music as well, of course. We'll be talking about that. Looking forward to hearing about his journey in just a moment as well. I do wonder how much thought you've been giving to the budget, whether it worries you, whether it bugs you, whether you just want to know how much more a beer is going to cost, which is a perfectly rational question, or whether, in fact, you think we're at some sort of tipping point in our politics or in our society where the delay in a budget really is going to actually cause trouble. It's kind of difficult to know at this point. And one of the strange things has been that we haven't had as much noise around it as I thought we might. I thought by this stage we might have the various political parties sort of briefing one way, briefing the other way, and basically trying to influence the conversation and the national conversation around the budget. For the moment, that hasn't happened. It might well start tomorrow, might well start on Wednesday morning, might well start immediately after the budget or immediately after the delay. And I made this point almost immediately after the postponement, which is that once you've had a postponement once, you just never have the same certainty. And I think that is going to be a real issue, is that the lack of certainty around the budget going forward is, I suspect, going to be a major problem for quite some time to come, is that there'll always be that sense of what is going to happen. Is this actually going to be enforced or not? And I think that maybe is going to be a major change from what we've seen in the past. And I do think that that is going to be a problem in our society. You're with The Money Show. The time coming up now to 7:30.
702. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
22 minutes to 8. Well, one of the joys of the conversations that we're able to have at this time on a Monday, when we go through someone's sort of career, find out what they've been doing, basically what they've been doing to make money for themselves and others, is that occasionally you get to speak to someone who you've been watching do different things for many years. And sometimes they surprise you, sometimes they do something, and then you sometimes wonder, I wonder how this is going to work out. And it's not often you speak to someone who's pretty much been able to turn everything he's touched into success. Tebogo, ProVerb, Thekisho is one of those people. He's a musician, he's a hip-hop artist, he's an MC, he's a DJ. He's a peer of mine because he works in the same business. ProVerb, I don't think we've shaken hands before. We've been in the same building before, but I think a few minutes ago was the first time we've shaken hands. And thanks so much for coming in and talking to us on The Money Show.
Today was absolutely official, Mr. Stephen, and thank you so much. Privileged to meet you. That very kind intro. Thank you so much. And I look forward to this conversation.
So you started in Kimberley, right?
Yes.
And I mean, Kimberley then and Kimberley now are different places, I suspect. The city centre, the areas around it. What was Kimberley like? What kind of, what was the situation like that you were growing up in at the time?
Look, that's never easy to answer, and I'll tell you why. Because at the time, you don't have anything to compare it to.
Yeah.
So growing up in Kimberley for me, it was a big metropolitan city. It was bustling. It was very rich historically, with the big hole, obviously, and everything that happened there. It's only until you get to leave and go to a bigger city that you kind of look back and realize, oh, wait a minute, I grew up in a small town, but otherwise, I have nothing bad to say about Kimberley. It's still my home, even though I don't have much of my family there anymore. But I still consider Kimberley home.
I mean, you were keen on entertaining. Music was different then. Popular culture was evolving really quickly. And I mean, yes, it always evolves in fits and starts.
Sure.
But to me at that time, the sort of, I presume, late 90s, he says, guessing?
Yeah, for sure.
South Africa and South African popular culture was changing completely. It was receiving more expression.
Yes.
More of it was being broadcast. You could see more of it on TV. You could hear more of it on radio. For someone who does what you do now, that must have been very exciting.
Look, not only that, but we were also very influenced by the global culture. By then we were getting the sort of programming from abroad. We were able to access it. So, a lot of how we were influenced, the reason I speak the way I do is because of the influences of back then, the way we dressed, our attitudes and all that was all as a result of the influence, but also because South Africa was no longer this kind of silo, There was now, a broader connection. And I think that exposure exposed us, influenced how we think about things, and even as not only from what we're consuming, but as creatives as well, who we were becoming.
There are a couple of programs that people will remember. There are even certain episodes that maybe will blast your memory back a little bit.
Yeah. Don't do it!
This is
Top left for Tebogo. All right, any song by Tupac. You're a rapper.
Here you go.
My prophecy, stress in the city, the cops are stopping me. The project is full of bullets, the bodies are drive day, they're stopping me. Constantly moving, I'm making millions. Winners and killers living there, bodies in the van of business. Carries and killers of the illin. Tension and killing in the appeal from the cap villain. Without billing, will there be last of the landed? Head of back.
Maybe he'll listen to this.
Come on, he's whack, man. He's whack. He's whack. Whack MC. 5. Okay, Tebogo, $500 for you, my man.
Wow.
That was a lot of money then, eh?
It was a lot of money. The year was 1999. No, it was the year 2000 on the dot. I had just landed in Johannesburg. I matriculated in 98, 99, came up to Joburg. And you know what? Wide-eyed, all these opportunities were in front of me. Everything from, your rap activity jams, which was at another radio station, your jam alleys we wanted to get onto. And when I finally did, I took to it. And you know something? That was the beginnings of it, really, because it honestly just spawned what was to be the rest of my life and my career.
So the person who found that clip is Peter, our technical producer.
All right.
And you will know, because you've been a technical producer,
yes,
the power that you have, what you can actually do.
For sure. Firstly, you give Peter too much credit. So I went and found that clip one year. I happened to be doing stuff with the channel. And I said, I was a contestant here one year. And of course, we looked through the files and all that. So I put that up on the internet. Now what happens is everyone goes to find what I initially found and then presents it back to me as if to say, look what we found. But anyway, I digress. So yes, I studied sound engineering. That's what I completed. And I was a sound engineer. And that's how I started my journey in radio as a technical producer.
So I was interested in that because, I mean, if there's one thing I know is that the way we're set up, so I'm in the same room as Peter, and I've worked in a place where you're actually the technical producer's in a different room,
right?
Which I hated, by the way. I didn't like that at all. The relationship between the presenter and the technical producer is absolutely key.
Yeah.
But there are very few cases where people go from one to the other. Either from behind the mic to, pressing the buttons all the other way.
Yeah.
You did. Was that always your aim?
It wasn't initially. It wasn't something that was on my mind. Look, just for timelines, run about this time, we're talking 2003, I also started on television.
Yeah.
So I was a continuity presenter. But I say that to say, while I was a technical producer, I was then working with the greats, DJ Fresh, I was a technical producer for. And I think exposure to that environment then sort of planted the seed. And then from that point, I actively started embarking on this journey to try get on air. And it happened much later, by the way.
Yeah.
No, it wasn't even immediate at all.
So you became a continuity presenter, and we kind of don't have those anymore. But they did set, and people forget how important they were because they set a tone.
Yeah.
I mean, some of them were celebrities. I mean, I can't remember the names, but there was, the white woman who spoke Zulu.
Yes.
People. There were all of these things going on at the same time. That must have been quite an experience. People would have stopped you in the street.
Something. So the channel that I was on was very popular across the continent.
Yeah.
So what would happen is, we would get invited to events in Botswana, in Kenya, and the like, and that's where it was a lot more of hyped than it was in South Africa. So yes, there was some degree of popularity that came here, but I must tell you, across the continent, it was more significant. What maybe got a little bit of attention and more talkability was the music journey, which was also concurrent. Everything kind of happened around about the same time, so they're all intertwined timeline-wise.
The music, the inspiration, I mean, we've just heard part of it, but
sorry for that.
Wonderful. So I mean, most people kind of pick one thing, TV or radio or whatever. Those two things work well together. Not many people get to do some music at the same time.
Yeah.
Were you feeling, was that something that was always in you to do that?
So music was kind of my initial passion and the thing I wanted to pursue. But I think I recognized very early on how short-lived it was. I also recognized that the genre that I had chosen, which was hip-hop, at the time, had no foot to stand on.
Yeah.
So because of that, there was too much at risk. So, I didn't want to end up going back to Kimberley. So I had to take on as many things as I could, to sustain myself, to live. So I was on radio at the same time that I was on television, at the same time that I was recording music, purely because I understood that no one was enough to sustain me. You know what I mean?
It's quite a hustle you were doing at the time. As a younger person, it's quite a hustle.
Look, and I don't think that has changed. I think I started with that attitude also because it was a leap of faith that I had taken. My folks kind of wanted me to do something else. I'm from an academic family. So because I didn't choose that path, I feel like I didn't give myself the choice or the option to fail.
Yeah.
And in order to kind of have some kind of, assurance of any kind of progress, I had to do multiple things.
It's one thing to show your parents you failed, but to show your siblings, you can't do that.
Exactly. This is it. 100%.
I would like to talk about Idols a little bit.
Yeah, let's do it.
because I was very interested in it. I mean, that was a big show at the time.
Yeah.
The climax was national news. Heinz Winkler, thanks for that, by the way. I mean, that must have been quite an experience. And it was national too. You went to different places.
Listen, biggest gig of my life, my career, probably just redefined, what was honestly and still is the rest of my life. So in 2009, I just came off the island of Santa Carolina after being a finalist on Survivor.
I didn't know that.
Yes. So I was a finalist on Survivor. And so I kind of caught wind by chance that they were holding auditions for a new host. So I went and tried out. And even still, my background up until that point had only been hip-hop television. But I did have some on-camera experience, which I think served me well. And so when I got that shot to host South African Idols, a couple of years in, I got the opportunity to be co-executive producer, which I was up until the very end. So, like I say, that changed my life. I am forever grateful. I think in the process, we got to touch a few lives. I just walked past MCZ James now, who's on the sister station, and he was one of the contestants on there.
Geez.
So every now and again, I will see these artists who've gone on to do amazing things. You mentioned Heinz Winkler, who's continued to thrive. Shakana, many others. We'll be here all night if I were to mention them. But the point is, I know the impact that had on others, but also profoundly so on myself as well.
Why do you think it ended? Because the format maybe was getting a bit old.
Yeah.
But I mean, America's Got Talent. My kids still watch it now.
For sure.
I mean, a lot of it's South African talent, I notice.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's interesting. That format of a show maybe had some space still to go. Maybe just not in this market.
No, it definitely does. And I'll tell you exactly why. So I happen to be doing my MBA, and my dissertation happens to be on the advent of digital disruptors on traditional media. And I think therein lies the answer.
Yeah.
So it was the digital disruptors. And I can get a lot more explicit on that if you like.
No, sure. So I mean, I know you do other things, and we're going to come to some of that in a moment. And some of that is quite academic and property and all the rest. The route to becoming known now. So the way you did it was you worked for a radio station, you did hip hop, you pushed and hustled and all the rest. The way people do it now, often in music radio and talk radio, and then onto other things, is through social media.
Yeah.
And that must form the kind of people who come through. Do you think that the sort of older media have been influenced by that? Do you think that the route has changed dramatically?
I think the evolution is not only inevitable, it's necessary, and I think it's up to traditional broadcasting, whatever that looks like, to adapt and to sort of implement some of these elements and adopt some of these elements. Otherwise we run the risk of falling out of favor with the market. Sure. So I think this is all part of the necessary evolution. When we started, back in the days, and can I say even the generation before us, things were not even the way they are now. Everything is sort of digital, and the nature of the digital animal is that it continues to evolve, and what it will look like in 5 years is not what it looks like now. So social media now seems to be an engine for a lot of things, and I feel like that's just a natural part of how it goes.
We're talking to ProVerb tonight on The Money Show, 9 minutes to 8.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of GTR Africa 2025.
If you want to know what ProVerb and I were talking about, he and Peter were discussing his vinyl collection.
That's right. That's how the greats do it.
Okay, so you still do all of the media stuff. You're still on the radio, but you also branched out into a few other things. You've been getting involved in property. How did that happen for you?
For sure. So that honestly for me was as I was getting older, a little bit wiser. You realize that entertainment is a little bit short-lived.
Yeah, anything can happen.
Yeah, as you kind of study, get to know more, get better advice, you try and look for alternate streams of income, both passive and otherwise. And for me, property was a wise way to go, because I know eventually there'll be some social media hit who will take my job, and rightfully so. And when they do, I can't wait for that day. When they do, I need to be able to continue to support my kids. Yeah.
And so what did you do? Did you just buy one? Did you buy a few? Did you start a company? Did you?
No. So I kind of bought one, then I bought a second, and then I bought a third. And then what I did was I actually went to study, because I realized that I'm blindly doing this thing. And so after studying, I then learned a couple of tricks, started, exploring some of the property investment strategies, 11 of which exist, or at least that I know of from what I've learned.
Are they all buy in Cape Town, buy in Cape Town, buy in Cape Town?
No, not necessarily. You know, there's all the buy, hold, buy, get tenants, buy, flip, add value, etc. You know what I mean? So there's all these respective strategies, but there's one that works for me because I'm an entertainer. I may not always have it. I prefer to buy, hold, get a tenant in there. So I do have a modest portfolio that's sort of spread across Cape Town, KZN. I was about to say the country, which makes it sound greater than it is. No. So, you know, Cape Town, KZN, and Gauteng.
Studying matters to you.
It does now, yeah.
I mean, is it the influence of your family? Do you have a sibling who's got a PhD and they're forever telling you about it?
Look, it's hindsight is 2020. I had the opportunity to study earlier. I didn't capitalize on it then. I was blindly chasing this desire of mine, which I achieved. But later on in life, I then realized I need more. I need some substance to it. And then I started by doing short courses. You know, in the process, sadly, I lost my mom, who in fact, she had 2 PhDs, let me tell you. My dad's a medical doctor as well. So I don't know, when I kind of got into the swing of it and then completed my bachelor's of business administration, I thought, why not take it further? I'm currently doing my MBA, busy with my final year. We spoke about a dissertation. And you know what, Mr. Stephen, I'm thinking of taking it all the way to a DBA. Yeah, why not?
Because Dr. Proverb works.
My dad once made a remark to my brother and I think he meant it in cheek and all that. And he said, you know, I would sleep so much better if one of you were a doctor. But I feel like now that echoes in my mind at all times to say, you know what? I think while I have the means, it'll, for myself firstly, right? But also just from a legacy point of view, I think to honor my folks, it'll be a great gift.
No, I can imagine. And the immense pride that will come from that in you and others. So when you think about sort of managing money for yourself and other people who may be in your life, obviously you want to do something that's sustainable, that lasts a long time, and you're doing it off. The anchor is still presumably the entertainment, and that's quite a tough anchor. You know, you don't know what's going to happen. Has that made you think a little further ahead than perhaps if you'd had a sustainable, boring job as an accountant?
Look, the first thing I did was, I got a financial advisor. That was the first thing I did. Then I did a course on investment management. That was the second thing I did, so that I knew how to engage, the kind of questions to ask, the kind of moves to make, the kind of ideas to bring to the table. And my financial advisor and I, we bump heads a lot. And I think that's a great thing because I've got my own ideas. I do my own reading, my own research, and I often bring it and I want to do this and I want to sometimes take it all and go get another property into this. And, we speak of, diversifying and all that. So absolutely, to come back to your question, I do think of how volatile entertainment is. And I think part of why I study is because I also am preparing for the life beyond it. Yeah. And I want that to be on my terms. Unfortunately, entertainment is very brutal. Many of us work on contracts and it's per season. And like idols, it can come to an end at a moment's notice. And so can my radio job, So when that happens, what do you do then? I can't only begin to craft my plan then, So I think I started, my plan has been in the works for a while, and it just kind of continues now.
I get a sense that you still thoroughly enjoy what you do.
Yeah, I love what I do. Look, I'm an entertainer at heart. I may not necessarily be an active musician, but I'm still very much a big part of the culture, and I'm entrenched in it. Until very recently, I was serving on the board of SAMRO, where I was trying to influence positive change to the industry at large. I think on my radio show, the kind of features that we have really seek to, do for other artists as well. And we give a platform for artists to unearth some talent. Naturally, the TV show, the format of it seeks to, find talent across the corners of the country. So, I'm very much a part of it. I'm very fulfilled by it. It's my first love, and I've just tried to evolve it, and grow so as not to say 20 years later you're still doing the same thing, trying to compete with younger guys, but to say, how can you, as you grow, contribute to it, but differently maybe. So that's maybe what has changed. But at the core of it, I still love what I do.
Proverb, it's been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you. It's been a great honor. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Sir, the honor is absolutely mine. I wasn't buying your face. There are some names that are so synonymous and ubiquitous with greatness within our space, and yours is one of them. So to be able to sit across the table from you and have this conversation, especially one as adult as money matters, is truly humbling. So thank you so much for having me.
Tebogo, really appreciate it. Tebogo, Proverb, Thekisho on The Money Show tonight.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa Corporate and Investment Banking, proud sponsor of GTR Africa 2025.
Well, from Proverb, what we'll be talking about tomorrow? Capital flows in the United States. I'm sure we'll be back then. Good evening. It's 8 o'clock.